I grew up in a town big on hunting. Whether I liked it or not, I got to hear all these stories about large takedowns of gigantic elk. Some of these stories were actually pretty good. These guys were excellent at hunting. After a while, the hunting stories got a bit old, but every once in a while they would talk about specific areas they liked to hunt and draw out for. The first time I had heard about this place was from one of the better hunters telling us about places his grandfather said to always avoid. His grandfather told him about a place in northeast Arizona called Pa-Coomb. All he told his grandson was that it was haunted. End of story, which really piqued my interest because it was the first ghost story I've ever known to be so short. No description of what haunts it, just that it's haunted and to stay clear of it. I heard this place mentioned again and again, but nothing ever more than it's haunted. I searched for this place with every Arizona map known to man. The place didn't exist, and that was the last I delved into looking for the area for a good 4 to 5 years. So it was the second year I had been doing fire. It was a great paying summer job, but it was insanely hard on my body. I was practically in tears when I found out that the last assignment I would be going on was going to be a research assignment. It meant hazard and overtime pay without having to bust our asses digging line like the rest of the hand crews. We would walk the perimeter of the fire and collect as much data as we could about its behavior. The area was a small mountain range surrounded by a desert in northeast Arizona. We packed up and headed out there. Usually, we sleep in tents, but there was an outpost that acted as our staging area for the fire. So we got 4 cabins to sleep in, 2 with large dorm-style hallways and 2 that were cabins reserved for IC and random higher-paid levels. This entire area was surrounded by a barbed wire fence and touched a beautiful meadow. We got there pretty late in the night, so we just decided to put our tents up and sleep outside, right outside the fence. It was quicker and we wouldn't be pissing off any of the hand crews trying to get some sleep in the bunks. A little later in the night, I walked out of my tent to take a leak. I walked a little ways from our campsite and got to business. I looked over and saw a deer grazing in the meadow. I remember thinking that I wanted a picture of it, but my phone's camera was horrible. About when I finished up, the deer all picked up their head and ears and stared at something on a bordering hill line. I couldn't make anything out, but it felt like the entire area got a bit darker. I was almost positive that whatever was over on that hill was looking right at me. The deer took off the other way and I speed-walked my way to my tent. We visited what was a hand crew that was based out of the same city as ours during breakfast. One of the guys spoke up about seeing some weird shit at night, like mountain lions just patrolling the perimeter of the fence at night, odd noises in the bunkhouses, and the eerie quietness at night. Another guy spoke up and mentioned his father telling him not to stray into Pa-Coomb when he came over to this outpost before he left for this fire. I was so damn excited when I heard that. I asked him where it was at, but he didn't know. He figured it was east of our outpost, in the direction of where the fire was. That hand crew headed back to our hometown, while we hiked over to the mountain to do our data collection. At lunchtime I scanned the maps we had in our packs for Pa-Coomb. Nothing. At that point I was fed up with the idea and just decided to forget about it. That night they got us some rooms in one of the bunkhouses. We kept our equipment trailer on the outside of the fence's perimeter, because there was a lot of in and out traffic in the small parking lot of this area. The bunkhouse hallway was pretty freaky. It really looked like a jail block, but with actual doors instead of bars. At the very end of the hallway was an emergency exit door with a small window at the top center of it. This led to the back of this area, which touched another meadow which I hadn't noticed before. I stared out the window in my room before I went to bed. A couple of deer were grazing along the edge of the perimeter. Then, like the night before, they shot their heads and ears up. Except this time, they were looking right at me. I flicked my headlamp on and off, and they split. At breakfast the next morning, one of the guys in my group mentioned that someone came into his room last night. He said we woke up to some dark figure just standing over him. When he called out to this person, the person got on all fours and crawled under the bed of his roommate. He was too out of it to know what the hell was going on, so he just went back to sleep. His door was locked, there was nothing under the bed in the morning, so he figured he was half asleep and seeing shit. I started to get a little uneasy about this place after that morning. Since the fire was slowing down and dying out, a lot of the hand crews assigned to our area were sent somewhere else. It wasn't long until our crew and IC were the only people in the outpost. We had to see this fire to the end and still needed to gather a lot more information. We got our first full moon about that time. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing us surrounded by storms in every direction, lightning everywhere except for straight above. After dinner I realized that I had forgot to input the data from that day's research. The crew started up a game of cards in the bunkhouse, and so I walked outside the perimeter to the equipment trailer. I turned on the generator and loaded up the computers. It took me a good hour to put the data in, but I got it saved and I started turning everything off. That's when I noticed the deer grazing in the meadow. The full moon lit up everything and the sight was pretty surreal. Just some deer grazing in the meadow, with lightning off in the distance. It didn't take too long before they perked their head and ears up, looking at the exact same spot they had looked the first night I had seen them. Right at the hill, right at this figure that was waving towards me. The way this thing moved its arm was almost mechanical. Little by little I could start making out the face. The eyes weren't there, just two very dark holes that took up a quarter of its face. The mouth looked like it was scratched into the face. It didn't look like it was possible to even open, just a long scratch across the face. Needless to say, this time, I ran away before the deer did. That day, me and two other guys were supposed to do weather reports and fire scouting. This basically meant that we were going to be sitting in the same spot for 14 hours and read the temperature/humidity over the radio throughout the day. The fire was practically out and the temperature was too damn hot. We gave the last weather report for the day and shot the shit until the leader told us to head off the mountain. At about dusk, we got in touch with our leader telling us that they had found an old cabin out on the side of the mountain. They were going to take pictures and tag it on the GPS, so they just told us to sit tight for a bit longer. We turned up our radio and took a nap. I woke up to one of the guys screaming, "Oh shit, oh shit." It was already night and there was smoke everywhere around us. The fire had obviously picked up in activity and was possibly moving very fast. We tried to contact someone on the radio, but we got nothing. We were absolutely terrified that the fire may have surrounded us at our lookout spot. We could barely make out 10 feet ahead of us at this point. It was a pretty unanimous decision to get the hell off the mountain. The problem being that the smoke was so thick that we couldn't see a damn thing and had to rely on a somewhat cheap GPS that tracked our waypoints back to the outpost. By the time we got to one of the outposts bordering meadows, the visibility had picked up substantially, but there was still haze from the smoke. We also got someone on the radio asking us where the hell we had been and that they were in the bunkhouse waiting for us. With that, we ran along the perimeter's fence line to the main gate. One of the other guys was the first to see it. Only two buildings. Everything was identical to meadows bordering the fence line and the general distance from the mountain, but there were only two buildings. The smoke was starting to get thick again, so we rushed to what we believed to be the bunkhouse anyways. As we ran to it, I noticed a rock just right outside the building that I had never seen before. It was huge and had 10 lines written on it. I couldn't make out the other symbols, but the 9th line down read Pa-Coomb Outpost. At that point I knew something was extremely wrong, but the other guys had already made it to the bunkhouse and were starting to walk inside. The main room was completely empty and the power was off. Our headlamps worked a lot better in the buildings, which were almost completely free of any smoke. Somebody got a hold of us on the radio, wondering where we were at. We told him that we got lost and might have stumbled into another outpost. I mentioned that we were at one of the bunkhouses in Pa-Coomb. He told us he'd be there in a moment. It was about that time that I realized I didn't know who the fuck that was. This entire time I had been assuming it was someone from the other crews, because they were using our channel, but everyone else had left except for our group and the IC. I didn't recognize this voice and neither did the other two. The screaming started soon after that call, coming from the bunk rooms. It sounded like a dozen men screaming out in pain. We ran to the hallway and heard the screams coming from almost every room throughout it. We ran to the first room. It was locked. The second was locked. Third was locked. We tried to ram some of the doors, but they were bolted. We finally found an unlocked room halfway down the hallway. Two burnt bodies, tied to their beds, were thrashing around in pain. I couldn't make anything out. Their faces had long been burned off and charcoaled. Their fingers and toes were gone. These men should have been dead, but they were kicking and screaming right before our eyes. I tried to hold down this person's feet as one of the other guys started to untie him. I remember grabbing the stubs he had for legs and my fingers sinking into the skin right down to the bone. Right before he untied the man's right arm, I backed up and vomited in the hallway. The smell was horrible. I glanced down the hallway to the emergency exit and saw the eyeless face, just outside, peering through the window. Once it saw me, it darted away from the door. The guy came on the radio again and started repeating, I'm here, and come through the exit in the back, we've been looking for you." One of the guys ran straight for the back emergency exit, before I could say a word. The other was trying to still help the writhing man. I grabbed him by the shoulders and yelled at him that we needed to get out of there. We needed to ignore that thing on the radio and just run. So we did. We ran right through that front entrance. Once we got outside the perimeter, we heard our guy screaming out in the back somewhere. It was a shitty move, but we just ran. We ran back up the mountain, with no GPS guide. We just kept moving, trying to get the hell away from wherever we just were. The smoke was starting to let up a little bit and we heard our guy over the radio. The reception was pretty bad at this point, but we could make out that he was asking us to come back. He was telling us that he found the rest of our crew and that they were waiting at the bunkhouse for us. He kept begging for us to come back when we didn't reply. By the time we got to the top of the mountain, we could hear nothing else but static and screaming. The last thing he said was, "They won't stop burning me." That was that. There was no smoke at the top of the mountain and we were able to see lights hiking through the forest below. We finally got comms with our crew, wondering where the hell we had been. We met up with them and explained the whole ordeal. They didn't believe us, but they did understand that there were only 2 of us out of the 3 they had sent up. They looked all night and day to find the other guy. We searched the area with the active fire, which was only the size of half an acre at this point, and that's when we found his body. It was curled up in a ball, right in the center of the burn area, almost unidentifiable from all the burns. I remember riding home in one of our vehicles and vaguely making out the sound of that guy's voice over the radio, still begging us to come back. Once the rest of the people heard that, they kept an open mind about the whole thing. I don't know what the hell that place was and I probably never will, but if you ever find yourself in Pa-Coomb, I suggest you get the fuck out of there.